In November 1992, a reporter from Art News was trying to track down a Van Gogh painting that went missing during World War II. He followed leads from a former Soviet soldier to St. Petersburg. Then, with the Hermitage Museum's director showing him around, he got into the 12-column hall. This place was closed to the public back then, and there he found a whole collection of classic masterpieces that had been locked away for almost 50 years. Now, here's the thing. Ever since Louis XIV's time, works of art have been super important tools for rulers to show off their money and power. After Napoleon turned the Louvre into France's National Museum, rulers all across Europe started to get a way better. Rulers all across Europe started to get a way better idea of how crucial it was to have a say in the art world. And just like Napoleon proved, one of the main ways to grab that power was to gather a huge, amazing collection of art, no matter how you got your hands on it. Take Napoleon's commission of monuments, for example. Then there's Hitler. He was a failed painter who ended up in power, and he also put together a top-notch team made up of experts and scholars. This group was led by Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazi Party's ideological leader. People even call him the Nazi High Priest. Their whole job was to oversee the looting of art, and they went storming across all of Europe. During the Nazi era, roughly 20% of all artworks in Europe were shipped to different storage spots in Germany. Hitler's plan was to use this as the core collection for a massive super museum in his hometown, Linz, Austria, a museum he wanted to be even better than the Louvre. Among these works, the classical masterpieces favored by Hitler constituted a significant portion. Although other Allied nations were astonished by this enormous sum, they tentatively agreed verbally, assuming Germany would never actually pay such a large amount and hoping to secure Soviet Union concessions on other issues. Back then, the Soviet Union was the main Allied force, fighting on the European front. And man, did the Nazis loot them hard? Post-World War II stats show, out of 992 museums across the Soviet Union, 427 got seized by the Nazis. Cities like Leningrad, their museums, churches, and palaces were all looted blind, then burned to ashes. Even the former homes of Pushkin and Tolstoy weren't spared. Their personal manuscripts got incinerated, and it didn't stop there. Chekhov's and Tchaikovsky's houses, plus October Revolution monuments and the Lenin statues all over the country, they were systematically plundered and destroyed too. And Hitler's goal with all this? He wanted to erase the Russian people's cultural memory, wipe out their history. But here's a silver lining. The Hermitage Museum and other major institutions rushed to evacuate parts of their connections to the Ural Mountains. They hid those artworks away, and luckily, they narrowly escaped being destroyed. The Soviets? They kept super detailed records of every single thing they lost. After the war, they demanded 10 billion in reparations from Germany. When you convert that to today's value using gold prices, that's around 150 billion, all to make up for the damage the Nazis caused during their invasion. Museums across Soviet Union submitted detailed inventories of their lost artworks and their estimated values. On paper, this list read like who's who of art history, with staggering valuations suggesting catastrophic losses. The Allies never saw this coming. The Soviet Union had a totally different plan. Instead of forcing Germany to pay that 10 billion, they used that demand as an excuse to launch a super direct, brutal payback. Think about it. They did to Hitler's Germany exactly what Hitler had done to the Soviet Union and all of Europe. As the tide of the war turned in the Allies' favor on the European front, people in the Soviet Union started speaking up. Their idea? Grab all the arts and Nazis have looted from other countries and bring it back to the USSR to make up for what their own museums had lost. Leading this push, Igor Graber, a post-impressionist painter, he wrote a letter to Special Commission for investigating fascist crimes, suggesting they set up a special department right away to make two lists. First, a list of all the art Soviet museums had lost, plus how much these pieces were worth. Second, a list of every artwork in museums from Axis countries. Then, they'd pick out pieces from that second list that matched the value of what the Soviets had lost, and take those as compensation. Graeber's idea got approved by the Special Commission super fast. Then he recommended two top dogs in Soviet art curation to lead the charge: Sergei Dakhnikov, who used to be the director of the Hermitage, and Viktor Lazarev, the head of the painting department at the Pushkin Museum of the Fine Arts. The head of the painting department at the Pushkin Museum of Fine Arts. Together, these three formed a special task force called the Expert Bureau, and their job was to put those lists together. Additional spoils were distributed to small regional museums for temporary storage, awaiting inventory. But here's a catch. A lot of those masterpieces they claimed were lost. They were total fakes, but they reported them as real deal originals. On top of that, Russia's always been on the sidelines of European culture. So the folks running Soviet museums, they had zero clue about art market prices in mainstream Europe. They just guessed the values based on what they thought. Total personal call, no real logic. Let me give you an example to blow your mind. A painting by the famous Russian artist Ilya Repin, the head of Leningrad's Cultural Preservation Agency, valued it at over 1.4 million. Why? Because he said it has priceless symbolic importance to the Soviet Union. Now compare that to Raphael's Sistine Madonna, favorite artist, and one of the most famous, highest-priced painters of all time. Back then, they only valued it at 2 million. And Van Gogh, he was Repin's exact contemporary, but his paintings sold for 100 times less than Repin's on the open market. This list was totally inflated. Now, Igor Grabar, he'd traveled all over Europe and spoke fluent German. He knew exactly what was up. He understood better than anyone. Russian art was basically worthless outside of Russia. So along with that inflated list, the Expert Bureau sent a totally honest report to the head of the Special Commission for investigating fascist crimes. They laid out all the messed up valuation discrepancies planned as day. But here's the thing about the commission members. They didn't know jack about the international art market, and they didn't care. All they needed was a list to use as a legal excuse to seize art from Germany. Once that list got approved, the Soviet occupation forces in post-war Germany went on a systematic looting spree. From Berlin, Leipzig, wooden crates stuffed with artworks were piling onto trains nonstop, heading to Leningrad and Moscow. Museum directors scrambled to set up teams working 24/7 to unload and count all the loot, but the crates were coming in way faster than they could process them. Soon, all the big national museums, libraries, and archives with unopened boxes. Directors had no choice but to just oversee stacking the crates higher and higher to make room for the next shipments. Most of the artifacts temporarily stored in small regional museums remained unprocessed, as Hermitage and Pushkin Museum lacked funding to send staff to distant locations to catalog them. Eventually, a lot of museums ended up with way more art than the original had. Let's take an example. Moscow State Historical Museum on Red Square. It only had 1,012 crates of its own collection, but it got 2,587 crates of looted art, more than double its original stuff. Now, let's talk about the Hermitage. Remember how they'd evacuated their pre-war connection to the Urals to hide it from the Nazis. After the war, they shipped all that back to St. Petersburg in 46 freight cars. On the flip side, they looted art from Germany. It arrived in 4 whole dedicated train convoys. That's way more than the 46 cars for their original connection. Once they finally counted everything, the Hermitage ended up with over 800,000 artifacts from the looting. Over in Moscow, the Pushkin Museum of Fine Arts got around 500,000 pieces too. But here's the kicker. These huge numbers, they're just a tiny fraction of all the art the Soviet forces plundered from Germany. To this day, the artworks plundered by the Soviet Union from Germany were officially and publicly regarded by Russia as compensation for the devastation inflicted by Nazi invasion. In the future, these pieces will continue to emerge in museum exhibition and auction houses. Even now, every once in a while, small Russian museums stumble upon sealed World War II era crates full of artworks that haven't even been opened or looked at yet. Just like Napoleon did after his wars, the Soviet Union returned a tiny bit of the looted art for diplomatic sake. This was in 1955, 2 years after Stalin died, and they gave it back to East Germany. The pro-Soviet German were talking big-name masterpieces here. Raphael's Sistine Madonna, Titian's Dana, and Georgian's Sleeping Venus, all sent back to Dresden's Old Masters Picture Gallery. But again, this was just a tiny drop in the bucket compared to all the art they'd stolen. Germany never even got a clear count of everything it lost. And during the post-war mess, a lot of the art the Soviets looted from Germany ended up in regular people's hands. For decades after the war, this art return issue was a super tricky diplomatic mess between the two countries. Hitler stole them first, then the Soviets stole them right back. Fast forward to June 2013, Angela Merkel visited Russia and went to the Hermitage and Pushkin Museum with Putin. Merkel brought up the art again, asking for the pieces that originally belonged to Germany to be returned. Putin's response: "These things don't belong to you guys either. Take Trojan gold, for instance. If I give it back to you, Turkey will ask you to give it back to them, and you won't be able to hold on to it. So let's just drop this." In 1995, to mark the 50th anniversary of beating Nazi Germany, the Hermitage showed off some of its World War II loot to the public for the very first time. Over 100 works, including Van Gogh's White House at Night, Degas' Place de la Concorde, and pieces by Monet, Gauguin, Renoir, Pissarro, and Matisse, finally saw the light of day after 50 years locked away. Months before the exhibition, the museum told the German government, through all kinds of channels, especially the original owners of the art of their family members, that they could buy the pieces back if they wanted. They also put out a detailed catalog of the show that tracked how each piece went from Germany to the Soviet Union, so potentially buyers could check it out. And to this day, no one really knows how many unaccounted for World War II artworks are still hidden in Russian museums or private collections. This ancient fortress was a crucial military outpost on the northwestern border of the Western Xia dynasty, and the mysterious ancient city depicted in the popular novel Ghost Blows the Light Out. Now, let's shift our focus east to what China calls the Western regions, a huge area in northwest China. This was around the late 1800s to early 1900s, when China's central government was weakening. Ancient cities like Loulan, Jinjue, and Donghuang's Mogao grottos were visited one after another by thousands of Western explorers, guys like Oral Stein and Paul Pelliot. They took advantage of the political mess to grab tons of cultural relics. And there was one key middleman that made their entry into China super easy: the notorious Russian consulate. This consulate didn't just help those so-called explorers and expeditions from different countries with local logistics, like getting around or finding guides. They also handed over detailed info on cultural relics and historical sites all over Xinjiang and the whole northwest region. They were tied with antiquities traffickers and even joined in the looting themselves, ending up with a huge collection of relics. From 1904 to 1913, with the Russian embassy's help, countless expeditions ransacked historical sites all over Xinjiang. To this day, tons of cultural relics from this area are still scattered across the globe. Because of this easy access, Russian explorers got to this area even before Stein and Pelliot. Back in 1894, a Russian geologist named Vladimir Obruchev led an expedition through the whole Northwest. This trip paved the way for all the Russian explorations. This trip paved the way for all the Russian explorations that came later. Then in 1905, he came back to China and went to Donghuang. He traded 6 packs of cheap, low-quality paraffin wax with Taoist monk Wang Yuanlu for 2 big bundles of manuscripts from the library cave. And in 1908, a former military officer named Kozlov led an expedition to Karakotal. That's the Blackwater city. Sitting on the banks of the Agenor River, while they failed to find fabled treasure, they uncovered piles of manuscripts written in an unfamiliar script, paintings adorned with mysterious symbols, and various Buddhist statues and ornaments. Karakolo wasn't huge, but it sat right at the crossroads of the Heishi Corridor and the northern grasslands. During the Western Xia dynasty's heyday, this place became a booming economic and cultural center, a complete record of the Western Xia's entire history. Now, here's a legend around it. When Genghis Khan's Mongol army surrounded the city, the Western Shah general defended it, knew all was lost. So before leading his troops in one final charge out of the city, he buried all the city's treasures hundreds of meters. He buried all the city's treasures hundreds of meters beneath the ground. This legend spurred Kozlov's expedition on. They launched a crazy, destructive dig at the Karakotal ruins. Although Chinese scholars have conducted several archaeological excavations in Karakatau since the founding of People's Republic of China, yielding over 5,000 artifacts, both the quality and quantity of these finds are far inferior to those looted by Kozlov. Kozlov had no idea how valuable these artifacts were. He just packed them up like he'd been told beforehand, then shipped them back to the Russian Geographical Society in St. Petersburg. The route went through Irgo, that's modern-day Ulaanbaatar, which was part of China back then, by the way. Months later, Kozlov was doing research in Qinghai when he got a telegram from St. Petersburg. It was short and to the point. It told him how incredibly valuable the stuff he'd brought back from Karakota was, and ordered him to head back to the site right away. This time, Kozlov went on a 9-day looting spree, digging up and ransacking almost every temple tower in and around Karakota. He found over 10,000 manuscripts and artifacts written in Tangut, Chinese, Mongolia, and Old Tibetan, and shipped all of them back to St. Petersburg. Any artifacts he couldn't take, they got destroyed, some more badly than others. Later, Orestein also went to Karakota. He dug through the mess Kozlov had left behind and still managed to grab over 4,000 documents. He took them back to Britain, where they ended up in the British Library. Now, the artifacts and documents that got sent to St. Petersburg were split between two places: the Hermitage Museum and the Institute of Oriental Manuscripts at the Russian Academy of Science. And for the most part, they just sat there untouched. Back in the late 1800s to the early 1900s, there was a big wave of sinology, that's the study of Chinese culture, in Western academic circles. Once that wave died down, only a tiny number of Russian sinologists spent the next 100 years trying to study and organize these documents. Here's a crazy stat. The Karakota manuscripts makes up 90% of all the surviving Tango documents in the world. But the Hermitage and Russia's Oriental Studies community, they've produced basically zero research on the Western Xia dynasty from these materials. Even when they published the photos of just a few of these Tango manuscripts, Chinese scholars who studied the Western Xia called it a huge breakthrough. This even made Russian a required language for anyone studying Tangut. To this day, if you want to research the Western Xia dynasty, you still rely heavily on the archaeological finds from Karakota. The artifacts and documents they connected were also shipped back to St. Petersburg, where they divided between Hermitage and the Archive of Institute of Oriental Manuscripts. In the 1950s, when Sino-Soviet relations were at the peak, the so-called Golden Age, the Soviet Union gave China a small number of Tangut manuscripts as gifts. Those are now kept in the Ancient Books Library of the National Library of China. But from the early 1960s up to the 1980s, Sino-Soviet relations went south, and because of that, research on the Western Xia dynasty totally ground to a halt. It wasn't until the 1980s, when relations started to thaw, that scholars tried again to get access to the Tangut manuscripts Russia was holding. They even hoped to get more as gifts through diplomatic channels. But by then, the Soviet Union was swamped with both internal and external crises. It was on the brink of collapsing. They had no money and no energy to deal with stuff like this. So Chinese scholars who studied Tangut proposed a collaboration. They wanted to work with the St. Petersburg branch of the Russian Academy of Science Institute of Oriental. They wanted to work with the St. Petersburg branch of the Russian Academy of Science Institute of Oriental Manuscripts and published all the Karakoda manuscripts. Here's the deal they offered. China would cover every single publishing cost, plus pay Russia an extra fee for the Russian Institute, which was totally cash-strapped. This was a super sweet offer, but the negotiations got really tense. An interpreter who was there at the time recalled what happened. The Russian representative was Nikolai Kichanov, the director of the St. Petersburg branch. He straight up refused the Chinese scholar's request to publish the entire connection. One Chinese representative got so frustrated that he shouted, "Those things are original ours. You stole them from our country." Kishanov shot back right away. "Then why don't you just send a few trucks over to take them all back?" A year later, Kishanov specifically tracked down the interpreter, who also worked as a section chief at the Chinese Academy of Social Science International Cooperation Bureau. He showed him a 1909 entry-exit permit issued by the local Qing government for Kozlov's expedition. His point was crystal clear. Kozlov, taking those artifacts from Karakoda, had been approved by the Chinese government back then, so it wasn't illegal looting like the Chinese were claiming. But come on, what does buying a ticket have to do with stealing? Now, at almost the exactly same time Kozlov was looting Karakoda, a German sinologist, Albert Guendel, led a professional expedition. The team had all kinds of experts, topographers, archaeologists, and interpreters. They went digging in places like Kashgar, Turpan, Kuga, and other spots in the region. These were shipped back to St. Petersburg, where they divided between Hermitage and archives of the Institute of Oriental Manuscripts of Russian Academy of Science. Sadly, some of these Xinjiang artifacts didn't get evacuated to the Ural Mountains with the other connections before the Nazi attacked Leningrad in World War II. They ended up getting destroyed in the fighting. Now, fast forward to August 1914, Grundel went back to the Mogao Grottos with the exact same team. This time, they stayed in Dunhuang for almost 6 months. They did a full survey and dug through over 400 caves. They didn't leave until late January 1915. Why? Because World War I had just broken out, which messed up in the international situation and made it way too unsafe for them to stay in China. And once again, the Taoist monk Wang Yuanlu, the guardian of the library cave, got tricked. He even helped count the artifacts while the team was taking them away. By the end, Gruendel's expedition took over 20,000 items. We're talking scroll paintings, silk paintings, paper paintings, sculptures, textiles, murals, and Buddhist scriptures, all kinds of stuff. Yet, when you stand before these authentic masterpieces, you still feel the same sense of reverence as when viewing Monet in Paris and Michelangelo in Florence. Now, let's talk about all these artifacts, the Tango ones, the Xinjiang ones, the Dunhuang ones, plus all the stuff during the Boxer Rebellion and hauled back to St. Petersburg. What happened to them? Well, some are on display in museums, some got destroyed in World War II, and most are just sitting in the storage vaults of the Hermitage U. And most are just sitting in the storage vaults of the Hermitage and the Institute of Oriental Manuscripts, mostly forgotten, gathering dust, geographically and culturally. Russia's always been on the edges of European civilization. But here's the thing, ever since Empress Catherine the Great built the Winter Palace, one Tsar after another went on a spree. Through non-stop buying, stealing, and seizing, they slowly turned St. Petersburg into a hub of art treasures, right up there with Florence during the Renaissance, or Paris in the middle 1800s, or Paris in the mid-1800s, when great artists were everywhere. This build-up of art even led to a world-class art school, one that's on par with Florence Academia and Paris Louvre, that gave Russia some clouds in the Western art world. But compared to those two cities, St. Petersburg's glitz feels really forced and over the top, like it's just piling up fancy stuff for show. Take the Baroque architecture here. It's already super ornate, but they cranked it up to 11. Total overkill. And the classical masterpieces inside, they feel totally out of place, like a kid wearing an adult's coat that's way too big. Even those broken Dunhuang murals and Caracotta's Buddhist statues, they give off this weird, indescribable, awkward vibe. But once you step outside the Tsarist palace, gaudily gilded on the inside, pastel colored on the outside, the city's overwhelming atmosphere immediately reminds you the masters do not belong here.